What Patton did to the officer who ignored abuse of displaced women. May 1945, a squalid displaced persons camp in Munich. Rain falls on rows of sagging canvas tents and muddy paths where thousands of freed Polish and Jewish women stand in silence. They survived the concrete barracks of the death camps only to find themselves pinned behind new barbed wire. A lone American nurse walks through the mud, carrying a concealed bundle of dry bread crusts under her wool cape. She heads toward a dark corner of the camp where an armed military police guard stands outside a wooden barracks door. Inside, a terrified teenage girl is bartering her dignity for a single tin of meat. The guard laughs, adjusting his belt, completely indifferent to her suffering. This routine cruelty operates under the open sky of liberated Europe, unnoticed by the high command, but a column of heavy olive-drab vehicles is already tearing down the highway toward the front gates. This is the story of what Patton did when an officer used his position to exploit the very people he was ordered to protect. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show humanity in the darkest places. First Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins was 28 years old, from rural Ohio, serving in the Army Nurse Corps. She grew up on a small dairy farm where hard work was a daily expectation. Her father had served in the previous war, leaving behind a legacy of quiet discipline that Jenkins carried into her military service. Before arriving in Germany, she had spent months working in field hospitals near the front lines, treating shattered bones and torn flesh under constant mortar fire. She had watched young men die in the mud, holding their hands when the morphine ran out. The violence of combat had hardened her hands, but sharpened her resolve to preserve human life. Now, assigned to a massive displaced persons camp, she faced a different kind of horror altogether. She found herself fighting an administrative battle against her own uniform, secretly smuggling her own meager rations into the dark barracks to keep starving women alive. Captain Arthur Vance was 35 years old, from an affluent family in Connecticut. Serving as the military police commander for the sector, he had never seen a day of actual combat, having used his family connections to secure a safe administrative post behind the lines. Vance lived comfortably in a requisitioned Bavarian villa, surrounded by stolen silver and fine artwork. He wore a custom-tailored uniform, a silk scarf tucked beneath his collar, and always smelled of expensive French cognac. To Vance, the thousands of freed Polish and Jewish refugees were not human beings who had survived the extermination camps, but rather an administrative burden. He saw them as a commodity to be managed and exploited for the benefit of his men. He frequently remarked to his junior staff that these people were accustomed to harsh treatment, and that his combat-weary troops deserved some recreation. This entrenched belief shaped every order he issued, turning a place of liberation into a closed fiefdom of exploitation. By May 1945, the European theater had reached a chaotic standstill. The German war machine was completely broken, leaving behind a continent fractured into millions of displaced pieces. Across Bavaria, hundreds of thousands of survivors emerged from the remnants of the camp system, possessing no homes, no families, and no immediate means of survival. The Allied armies suddenly found themselves responsible for an administrative nightmare of unprecedented scale. Supply lines were already stretched to the absolute limit, struggling to feed advancing combat divisions while simultaneously providing medicine to dying civilians. In this vacuum of authority, temporary camps were thrown up overnight, often managed by rear echelon units with little oversight from the supreme headquarters. Military police detachments and administrative officers were granted immense authority over these isolated populations, operating with wide autonomy, far from the oversight of tactical commanders. Many officers treated these assignments as administrative chores, focusing entirely on logistical quotas rather than the human reality inside the wire. Some commanders simply looked the other way when irregularities occurred, prioritizing the morale of their own tired soldiers over the discipline of the occupation. Reports of corruption, black market trading, and the mistreatment of refugees frequently vanished into the bureaucratic chain of command. Higher headquarters remained preoccupied with tracking down fleeing high-ranking officials and securing captured munitions. leaving the daily management of the civilian camps to local administrators, who answered to no one but themselves. The widespread breakdown of local infrastructure meant that basic items like tinned meat, fresh water, and clean blankets became instruments of absolute power. In the mud of the Munich sector, this systemic neglect hardened into an organized system of institutional cruelty, concealed behind official manifests and locked wooden gates. Lieutenant Jenkins walked directly into the military police headquarters building, her boots leaving a heavy trail of wet mud across the polished floorboards of the main hallway. She did not stop to brush off her uniform or wait for permission from the desk sergeant. She pushed open the heavy oak door to the commander's private office without knocking. Captain Vance sat behind a massive mahogany desk, a crystal glass of amber liquid resting near his right hand. He looked up slowly, a slight smile forming on his face as he adjusted the silk scarf around his neck. Lieutenant Jenkins stood at rigid attention before the desk, holding a manila folder tightly against her side. "Captain, I am presenting the third formal report regarding the guard rotations at the barracks," she said. Vance took a slow sip from his glass, setting it down with a soft click on the wood surface. "I believe I told you what happens to paperwork that bypasses my standard desk sergeant, Lieutenant. The guards are withholding the tinned rations from the Polish and Jewish women unless they comply with physical demands," Jenkins said, her voice taut. "This is a clear violation of the military code, and it constitutes systematic abuse of liberated persons under our direct care." Vance leaned back in his leather chair, interlocking his fingers behind his head while looking at her with complete indifference. "Those women have spent years surviving under the previous regime, Lieutenant, so they are entirely used to doing whatever it takes to get a meal. They are survivors of the death camps, Captain, not commodities for your men," Jenkins replied, stepping closer to the desk. "The medical logs show advanced malnutrition because the food is being diverted directly to the guards' quarters. My men have been fighting their way across Europe for months while you were sitting safely in a field hospital," Vance said, his tone turning cold as he leaned forward. "They deserve some rest and relaxation, and if the local population wants to show their gratitude for being liberated, I am certainly not going to stop them. This is a court-martial offense, Captain, and I have documented every single instance of this coercion over the past 2 weeks," Jenkins said, placing the manila folder directly onto his clean blotter. Vance looked down at the folder for a brief second, then reached out and swept it off the edge of his desk with the back of his hand, sending the loose sheets of paper scattering across the floorboards. "Your reports belong exactly where the last 2 went, Lieutenant. Go back to your bandages and let my soldiers handle the security of this camp." Jenkins looked at the papers on the floor, then raised her eyes back to Vance. "I will take this directly to the Inspector General," Vance laughed softly, picking up his glass once more. "Go ahead and try, Lieutenant, because the Inspector General is currently 300 miles away in Frankfurt, and nobody care about a few camp followers in Munich." Jenkins did not answer, turning sharply on her heel and marching out of the office. She walked straight to the communications tent and demanded an immediate patch to the 3rd Army headquarters. The detailed report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the gate. 4 stars on his helmet, ivory revolvers on his belt. The heavy vehicle skidded to a halt in the deep mud, its engine roaring before cutting out into a sudden, tense silence. The guards at the gate froze, their rifles slipping from their shoulders as they scrambled to present a frantic salute. Patton did not acknowledge them. He climbed out of the passenger seat, his leather boots sinking straight into the brown mire, and walked unannounced into the camp office. Everyone in the room registered his presence instantly. The ambient noise of clicking typewriters and low chatter vanished. Captain Vance dropped his half-full glass of cognac, the amber liquid splashing across his pristine desk blotter as he scrambled to his feet, his face turning pale beneath his tailored uniform. Patton studied him. The general stood entirely motionless, his gloved hands resting loosely near his ivory revolvers, his eyes locking onto the silk scarf tucked neatly under the captain's collar. "Is this your command, Captain?" Patton asked. "It is, General," Vance stammered, adjusting his belt. We are maintaining strict order in accordance with standard sector protocols. Have you inspected the food distribution manifests for the civilian barracks today? Patton asked. My staff handles the daily logistical tallies. General, Vance replied, his voice shaking slightly. The refugees are receiving their designated emergency rations. Lieutenant Jenkins presents a documented log stating your men are withholding those rations for personal favors, Patton said, his voice quiet, but it carried. Did you receive this report? Vance shifted his weight, looking desperately toward the open doorway before clearing his throat. General, those reports are highly exaggerated by an emotional nurse, he said. These displaced persons are completely accustomed to harsh treatment from the previous regime, and my combat-weary men simply require some natural recreation after months on the front line. Patton said nothing for a long moment. Then he spoke. You sit in this requisitioned villa, smelling like a French tavern, while the people we came to liberate are treated like animals beneath our own flag. Patton said. You believe your uniform grants you the right to inherit the cruelty of the enemy we just defeated. The men under your command took the field to destroy a system of human degradation, not to manage a cheaper copy of it for their own amusement. Patton continued. Your excuse is not a defense, Captain. It is a full confession of cowardice and administrative rot. Lieutenant Jenkins has seen the true cost of this war in the blood of American soldiers who died to restore basic human decency to this continent, Patton said. She spent her days preserving life while you spent yours calculating the trade value of a woman's dignity for a tin of meat. You have a choice, Captain, Patton said. You will either stand trial before a general court-martial for this systemic violation of military discipline, or you will experience the exact conditions you claim these survivors are used to tolerating. Decide now. Vance stood entirely paralyzed, his mouth opening slightly, but producing no sound, as his hand trembled against the edge of his mahogany desk. Patton did not wait for the captain to find his voice. He stepped forward, his jaw set in a hard, straight line, and reached directly for the captain's collar. With a single, sharp jerk of his gloved hand, Patton physically ripped the silver captain's bars straight off Vance's uniform, tearing the fabric and sending the small pieces of metal clattering across the mahogany desk. He turned to the two military police guards standing at the door and ordered the immediate confinement of the officer. Within minutes, Vance was stripped of his custom-tailored coat and his silk scarf. Under the direct glare of the afternoon sun, he was marched through the center of the camp, his polished low-quarter shoes sinking deep into the cold, gray mud of the main thoroughfare. Thousands of displaced women watched from the edges of the gravel paths, standing in absolute silence as the man who had traded their lives for rations was paraded past their quarters. Vance was forced directly into the worst, most squalid wooden barracks in the furthest corner of the perimeter, a drafty structure with shattered windows and a leaking canvas roof. The guards handed him a rusted iron bucket and a wooden shovel. For 7 full days, while awaiting his formal court-martial, the former commander was required to empty the camp latrines by hand. He labored in the foul trenches from dawn until dusk, his hands blistered and his uniform covered in filth. Standing just 5 feet away during every hour of his punishment was Lieutenant Jenkins. She stood perfectly upright in the mud, her eyes unblinking, supervising every stroke of his shovel to ensure the task was completed without a single moment of rest. Lieutenant Jenkins remained in Germany until the winter of 1945, supervising the medical rehabilitation of the camp survivors before finally returning to her family farm in Ohio. She married a local schoolteacher, raised 3 children, and spent over 30 years working as a head nurse at a county hospital. She rarely discussed her time in Munich with her neighbors, but she kept a small, rusted iron lock from the camp barracks inside her cedar chest for the rest of her life. She died quietly in her home in 1988, remembered by her family as a woman who never tolerated a violation of dignity. Arthur Vance spent 6 months in a military stockade before a general court-martial stripped him of his commission, finalized his dishonorable discharge, and sentenced him to 3 years at hard labor in a federal penitentiary. Following his release from prison, his family wealth could not shield him from the permanent stigma of his conviction. He relocated to a small town in New Jersey, working as an obscure inventory clerk for a manufacturing firm. He lived in near isolation, refusing to attend any veteran reunions or family gatherings, and died in bitterness in 1974. General Patton never recorded the details of the Munich camp incident in his public diaries, preferring to leave the administrative discipline to his staff officers. However, he wrote a brief private letter to his wife just 3 days after the inspection, noting that the true test of an army is how it comports itself when the fighting stops. He remarked that an officer who steals from the helpless is a greater enemy to the flag than any soldier wearing a gray uniform. Some historians have argued that Patton's immediate, heavy-handed punishment of the local sector commander bypassed the formal channels of military bureaucracy and disrupted the established legal protocols of the theater. They suggest that such public theater threatened the uniformity of the Army judicial system during a period of intense organizational transition. Others have argued the opposite, maintaining that the absolute breakdown of local infrastructure and civilian protection demanded immediate, visible correction to maintain the honor of the command. They argue that a slow administrative inquiry would have allowed systemic exploitation to continue unchecked behind the wire. What is certain is that the camp inspection record established a strict precedent for the immediate care of displaced persons across the entire occupied zone. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have left the matter entirely to the slower channels of the formal court-martial? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about humanity in the darkest places, make sure to subscribe.